In 1998, a young girl from a small American town was playing in her backyard, while her mother did laundry inside. But when she went to check on her daughter, just minutes later, she had vanished without a trace. Then after nearly 3 years with no answers, cleanup crews working in a flooded swamp after heavy rains unearthed something shocking. Buried in the mud, a discovery that would haunt investigators and expose the most disturbing truth imaginable. The morning sun filtered through Sarah Whitmore's kitchen window, casting warm rays across the counter where she cracked eggs into a bowl. The rhythmic whisking filled the quiet house, a house that had been too quiet for 3 years now. At 42, Sarah had learned to navigate the silence, but mornings were still the hardest. Emma had always been an early riser, bouncing into the kitchen with her blonde curls wild from sleep, demanding pancakes shaped like butterflies. The phone's shrill ring shattered her thoughts. Sarah glanced at the clock, 7:23 a.m. Too early for casual calls. Her hand hesitated over the receiver before lifting it. Sarah Whitmore. The voice was professional, careful. Yes. This is Detective Carl Morrison from the Pine Ridge Police Department. I'm sorry to call so early, but we need you to come down to Blackwater Swamp. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. Blackwater Swamp was 15 miles outside their small Oregon town, a place of dense wetlands and twisted trees that locals avoided. What's this about, ma'am? Our volunteer cleanup crews have been working the flood zones after last week's heavy rains. They found something. A pause. We believe it might be connected to Emma's case. The bowl slipped from Sarah's other hand, eggs splattering across the linoleum. You found her. We found remains, small remains. I'd rather not discuss details over the phone, but we need you to come identify some items. Sarah's legs gave out. She sank onto the kitchen stool, her free hand gripping the counter's edge. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Mrs. Whitmore, I want to prepare you. This will be difficult. Do you have someone who can drive you? I'll manage. Her voice came out stronger than she felt after hanging up. Sarah stood motionless in her kitchen, egg dripping down the cabinet face. 3 years of searching, of hoping, of jumping every time the phone rang, and now this. She moved mechanically to the drawer where she kept Emma's file, the worn manila folder she'd assembled with copies of police reports, photos, newspaper clippings. Her hands shook as she grabbed her keys from the hook by the door. The drive to Blackwater Swamp stretched endlessly. Pine Ridge, familiar streets, gave way to rural highway, then to the narrow access road that wound through Oregon's dense coastal forest. Sarah had driven this route only once before, during the initial search, when they'd combed every inch of wilderness within a 50-mile radius. The morning mist clung to the treeing, and the road was still wet from recent rains. As she approached the swamp, the scene ahead made her stomach clench. Police vehicles lined the muddy access road, their lights creating an eerie strobe effect in the morning haze. Crime scene tape cordoned off a large area near the water's edge. People in protective gear moved purposefully around a central point of focus. Sarah parked behind a forensics van and sat for a moment, gathering courage through her windshield. She could see Detective Morrison's familiar figure, a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair, the lead investigator who'd worked Emma's case from day one. He spotted her car and began walking over Sarah. He opened her door, his expression grave but kind. Thank you for coming. Where is she? The words came out raw this way. But I need to warn you about what you're going to see. Morrison guided her toward the taped perimeter, his hand gentle on her elbow. The flooding washed away years of sediment. A volunteer found it this morning. An old oven partially buried in the mud. An oven. Sarah's mind couldn't process the word. They reached the inner perimeter, where forensics teams worked. On a blue tarp sat an appliance that seemed grotesquely out of place in the swamp setting. It was a vintage model from the 1960s, the bright red enamel still Visible beneath layers of rust and mud, the door was sealed shut with some kind of industrial adhesive. Multiple layers crudely applied. Inside we found, Morrison's voice caught. He gestured to an evidence table, where clear bags lay in neat rows. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes focusing on the contents, small bones too. Small, laid out in anatomical order, but it was the fabric fragments that destroyed her. Pieces of velvet, fused to metal, scorched but still recognizable, the white lace trim, delicate. Despite the damage, exactly like the collar of Emma's favorite dress. No, the word came out as a whisper, then a scream. No. Sarah's knees buckled. She hit the muddy ground hard, her hands clawing at the earth. That dress, Emma had worn it to her 6th birthday party just 2 months before she vanished. She'd insisted on wearing it, constantly calling it her princess dress. Sarah had finally convinced her to save it for special occasions, promising she could wear it to church on Sundays. Detective Morrison knelt beside her, his own eyes wet around them. The forensics team had stopped working, giving her this moment of raw grief. The swamp was silent, except for Sarah's broken sobs and the distant call of mourning birds, indifferent to human tragedy. As Sarah struggled to process what she was seeing, still on her knees in the mud, a familiar voice cut through the crime scene's controlled chaos. Sarah. Oh God, Sarah. She looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see Mark Whitmore pushing past the outer perimeter tape. Her ex-husband's face displayed the perfect mixture of shock and grief, his usually composed features crumbling as he took in the scene. He was still wearing his hardware store uniform, the red vest with Whitmore's hardware embroidered on the chest. Sir, you can't. A uniformed officer moved to intercept him. That's my daughter. Mark's voice cracked. I heard on the radio they said remains at Blackwater Swamp. That's my little girl, Detective. Morrison looked between Sarah and Mark, then nodded to the officer. It's okay, he's Emma's father. Mark rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside Sarah in the mud. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against him. We'll get through this together, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, just like we always promised we would for Emma. Sarah found herself leaning into his familiar embrace too, shattered to maintain the walls 3 years of divorce had built between them. Mark's plaid shirt smelled of sawdust and coffee, the same scent that had once meant home. Detective Morrison crouched near them, his voice professionally gentle. I know this is incredibly difficult, but I need to explain what happens next. We'll need to run DNA tests to confirm identification, but given the size of the remains and the dress fragments, he paused, choosing his words carefully. The likelihood is very high that this is Emma. Mark's arm tightened around Sarah. How long until you know for certain? The initial tests will take about 72 hours. The full forensic examination will take longer. Morrison looked between them. I'm so sorry. I wish I had better news. Mark helped Sarah to her feet, keeping his arm supportively around her waist. We should go through Emma's case files again, he said, addressing both Sarah and the detective. Now that there's new evidence, maybe we missed something, some detail that could help you find who did this. Morrison nodded. That would be helpful sometimes. Fresh eyes on old evidence can reveal connections we didn't see before. Sarah wiped her muddy hands on her jeans, trying to compose herself. The files are at my house. Her voice sounded distant, disconnected. I'll follow you there, Mark said quickly. We can go through everything together. They walked back to their vehicles in silence, Mark helping Sarah navigate the uneven ground behind them. The forensics team returned to their grim work, photographing and cataloging every detail of the scene. Sarah sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine, watching in her rear view mirror as Mark climbed into his pickup truck. The drive back to Pine Ridge passed in a blur. Sarah found herself at her house, the same 1970s ranch style, where Emma had vanished from the backyard without remembering the journey. Mark's truck pulled into the driveway behind her. Inside the house felt suffocating. Every corner held memories of Emma, her artwork still magneted to the refrigerator, her height marks penciled on the kitchen doorframe, her favorite cereal still in the pantry because Sarah couldn't bear to throw it away. "I'll make coffee," Mark said, moving to the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd once lived here despite 3 years of divorce. He still knew where everything was kept. Sarah mechanically retrieved the case file from the kitchen drawer and spread its contents across the dining room table. Police reports, witness statements, photos, maps, marked with search grids, 3 years of desperate searching laid out in neat piles. Mark returned with 2 mugs, setting one near Sarah's hand. September 15th, 1998, he read from the top report. Though they both knew every word by heart, "Emma was playing in the backyard while you were doing laundry. I checked on her every 10 to 15 minutes. Sarah recited the familiar guilt washing over her. She had her dolls out by the swing. Said she was making them have a tea party at 3:30 p.m. You went to check again, and she was gone." Mark continued. "The back gate was open. I know. I latched it. I always latched it." Mark reached across the table, touching her hand. "Briefly, no one blames you, Sarah. Whoever took her knew what they were doing." He pulled out his own alibi documentation. "I was at the store. 3 employees saw me, plus the security cameras showed me at the register. Until 5:45. Sarah stared at the photos of Emma spread across the table. Her daughter's bright smile beamed up at them, frozen in time. Mark picked up one particular photo, Emma in her red velvet dress, at her 6th birthday party, chocolate cake smeared on her cheek. "That red dress," he said softly, his finger tracing Emma's outline in the photo. "She wanted to wear it everywhere. Remember how she tried to wear it to the grocery store? I had to hide it sometimes just to wash it." Sarah whispered. "Whoever took her," Mark said slowly, setting down the photos. "They must have been watching, known our routines. When you did laundry when the neighborhood would be quiet." Sarah nodded. The same thought that had haunted her for 3 years, but everyone was questioned. Every neighbor, every delivery person, everyone who'd been near our street. "Maybe we need to think differently now," Mark suggested with this new evidence. "Maybe there's a pattern we didn't see." Before they sat together at the table where they'd once shared family dinners, surrounded by the documentation of their worst nightmares, searching for answers in pages they'd memorized long ago. After Mark left to give her space, Sarah found herself alone in the house, with the case files still spread across the dining table. She tried to focus on the reports, but her mind kept returning to that grotesque image, the red oven sitting on the blue tarp, sealed shut with layers of adhesive, like some kind of monstrous cocoon. Something about it nagged at her beyond the obvious horror. The color, maybe, or the style. She'd seen ovens like that before, but where? Sarah picked up her phone and dialed Detective Morrison's direct line. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Morrison here, Detective. It's Sarah Whitmore. I need to ask you something about the oven." "Of course. What do you need to know? Could you send me photos of it, close-ups, if you have them? Something about it feels familiar." There was a pause. "Familiar how? I don't know exactly. Maybe it's just my mind trying to make connections, but I'd like to study it more carefully. I can email you the preliminary photos we took at the scene. Give me about 10 minutes. Sarah powered up her laptop, a bulky Dell that took forever to boot. While waiting, she cleared a space on the dining table, pushing aside the papers. She and Mark had been reviewing. The email notification chimed, and she opened Morrison's message to find 6 high-resolution photographs. The oven filled her screen in vivid detail. Despite the mud and rust, the distinctive cherry red enamel was still vibrant in places. The chrome handles were Art Deco in style, with elegant curves that marked it as a premium model from decades past. She zoomed in on the manufacturer's plate, Westinghouse. Though the model number was partially obscured by corrosion, Sarah printed the photos on her inkjet printer. The colors coming out slightly off, but clear enough. She studied them spread across the table, that nagging familiarity still tugging at her consciousness. The red was so specific, not fire engine red or burgundy, but something in between, almost candy. Apple in tone. Making a decision, she grabbed the photos and her purse. There were several appliance stores in Pine Ridge, including vintage specialty shops that catered to the town's historic district. Her first stop was Modern Appliance on Main Street. The young salesman looked at the photos with polite interest, but shook his head. "That's way before my time, ma'am. Maybe try Retro Kitchen down on Oak." Retro Kitchen's owner, a woman in her 40s, recognized the style but not the specific model. "Definitely 1960s, she said, examining the photos under a magnifying glass. That red was popular for a few years, but ideal mostly in 1950s pieces. You might want to check with Harold at Handy's." Handy's Appliance Repair occupied a narrow storefront on the edge of town, the kind of place that had been there forever and fixed everything from toasters to washing machines. The bell above the door chimed as Sarah entered, the scent of motor oil and old metal filling her nostrils. Harold Hansen looked up from a disassembled mixer on his workbench. He was well into his 70s, with thick glasses and hands that spoke of a lifetime of repair work. "Help you, miss?" Sarah approached with the photos. "I'm hoping you might recognize this oven model." Harold wiped his hands on a rag and accepted the pictures, holding them under his bench. His face changed immediately, eyebrows rising with recognition. "Well, I'll be. That's a 1964 Westinghouse Gourmet Series. See those handles? Dead giveaway. They only made that particular red from 64 to 67, called it Candy Apple Deluxe." He looked at her over his glasses. "Don't see many of those anymore. Where'd you come across this one?" Sarah's throat tightened. "It's part of a police investigation." Harold's expression sobered. "I see." He studied the photos again, then looked up sharply. "You know, funny thing, I actually sold one just like this, maybe three and a half years ago. Don't get much call for vintage ovens, so it stuck in my mind." Sarah's heart began racing. "Do you remember when exactly? Let me check." Harold moved to a shelf lined with old ledgers, running his finger along the spines until he found 1998. He flipped through pages, covered in his careful handwriting. "Here we go. April 18th, 1998. Westinghouse Gourmet Series Candy Apple Deluxe, cash sale $450. 5 months before Emma vanished." Sarah gripped the edge of the counter. "Do you remember who bought it?" "Cash sale, so no name required back then, but I remember the fellow, middle-aged, very particular about wanting that exact color, said it would match his kitchen perfectly." Harold adjusted his glasses, thinking. What struck me as odd was, he asked all sorts of technical questions: what temperature it could reach, how well it retained heat, interior dimensions. Most folks buying vintage pieces just want them for decoration or light use. "Can you describe him?" "Average height, brown hair, maybe 40-ish. Nothing particularly memorable, except how specific he was about the color and those strange questions. He even asked if the door sealed tightly." Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed the ledger entry with her phone. "Thank you, Harold. This is very helpful. Hope it helps with whatever you're investigating," Harold said, returning to his workbench. Sarah sat in her car outside. Handy's immediately calling Detective Morrison. He listened without interrupting as she relayed Harold's information. "Interesting timing," Morrison said when she finished, "but Sarah, you have to understand, thousands of people own vintage appliances. This could be purely coincidental." Stappered someone asking about heat retention and door seals. Sarah's frustration bled through. Doesn't that seem significant? I'm not dismissing it. We'll add it to the file. Cross-reef implications made her stomach turn later that afternoon. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the photos of the ledger entry on her phone. April 18th, 1998. The date seemed to pulse with significance, even if Detective Morrison didn't see it that way. She felt Mark should know about this development. Whatever their differences, he was still Emma's father and deserved to be kept informed. She dialed his cell number, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times. Before he picked up, "Hello, Mark," sounded slightly out of breath, as if he'd been running. "Mark, it's me. I'm sorry to bother you, Sarah." "No, it's fine. Are you okay? Did something happen?" "I found out something about the oven. I visited some appliance stores with photos, and this vintage repair shop owner remembered selling that exact model. In April 1998, 5 months before Emma, she heard Mark's breathing on the other end, then a slight echo as he shifted fence. Appliance sales with our suspect lists, but without a name or better description, it's not enough to go on. Sarah knew he was right. But the timing unsettled her deeply. Someone had bought that exact model of oven 5 months before Emma vanished. Someone who cared about temperature and tight seals. The phone, April 1998. That's quite a coincidence. That's what I thought. The buyer paid cash, asked strange questions about temperature and how well the door sealed. Sarah Mark's voice was gentle but skeptical. Probably dozens of people bought similar ovens around that time. Vintage appliances were trending, remember that? Whole retro kitchen movement. His voice sounded oddly distant, with a hollow quality that made Sarah wonder about his location. "Where are you? You sound like you're in a cave or something." A pause. "I'm at the cabin, the old place up at Deer Lake. After this morning, I needed to get away from town for a bit." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "The cabin? I thought you sold that during the divorce." "I was going to," Mark said quickly, "had it listed and everything, but when it came time to sign the papers, I just couldn't. Too many memories, you know, all those summers with Emma." Sarah fell silent. She distinctly remembered him promising to sell it, remembered her relief at not having to fight over the property the cabin held. Too many family memories, teaching Emma to swim off the dock, roasting marshmallows by the outdoor fire pit, the 3 of them cuddled in the loft during thunderstorms. "Sarah, you still there?" "Yeah, I'm here, listen." Mark's voice brightened, taking on an almost eager quality. "Why don't you come up? I know today's been hell, and if you need to talk more about these findings, about Emma, about anything, I'm here. We're both dealing with this, and maybe we shouldn't be doing it alone." "I don't know, Mark. I was just about to start dinner anyway. Got steaks defrosting, you know. I hate eating alone, especially on a day like this. I could drive back down and pick you up. It's only 40 minutes. Sarah looked around her empty kitchen, at the case files still scattered on the dining table, at the silence that pressed in from all sides. Maybe he was right. Maybe being alone with her thoughts wasn't helpful right now. "Okay," she heard herself saying, "if you're sure it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all. I'll be there in 45 minutes, and Sarah, we'll figure this out. Whatever happened to our baby girl, we'll make sure she gets justice." After hanging up, Sarah wandered into Emma's room. She'd kept it exactly as it was the day Emma disappeared. The unicorn comforter smoothed over the twin bed, stuffed animals arranged just so, crayon drawings taped to the pink walls. She sat on the edge of the bed, picking up Emma's favorite teddy bear, breathing in the faint scent that still clung to it. The cabin, she hadn't thought about it in months, had pushed those memories into a locked box. In her mind, they'd bought it the year Emma was born, a rustic but charming place where they could escape. Mark's demanding work schedule, those early years, had been good. Mark seemed to relax there, became the father Emma deserved. He taught her to fish with infinite patience, built her a fairy house in the woods, read her stories by the fireplace, but as his hardware business grew, the cabin trips became less frequent. Work always interfered. Emma would pack her little suitcase and wait by the door, only to have Mark call and cancel. "Next weekend, princess." He'd promise, but next weekend never seemed to come. Sarah fingered the bear's worn fur, remembering the fight that finally ended their marriage. Emma's 5th birthday party. Mark had promised to leave work early to be there for the cake. Instead, he'd arrived after all the guests had gone, Emma asleep on the couch in her party dress, dried tears on her cheeks. "Why doesn't Daddy love me?" she'd asked earlier, and Sarah had no good answer. The divorce had been swift and relatively civil. Mark didn't fight for custody. He knew his work schedule made it impossible. He'd agreed to sell the cabin, or so she'd thought. Now she wondered why he'd kept it. Sentiment, stubbornness, or just another promise he'd broken. A horn honked outside. Sarah looked out Emma's window to see Mark's pickup in the driveway. She placed the teddy bear back on the bed, grabbed her purse, and locked the house behind her. Mark stepped out to open the passenger door for her, a gesture from their early dating days. He looked tired, stress lines deeper around his eyes, but he managed a small smile. "Thanks for coming," he said as she climbed in. "I know things are complicated between us, but today, we need to be Emma's parents first." Sarah nodded, buckling her seatbelt. As they pulled away from the house, she noticed Mark's hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, a nervous energy radiating from him. She attributed it to the day's emotional trauma. They were both barely holding it together. The truck smelled of pine air freshener and coffee, with something else underneath, a chemical smell she couldn't quite place. Mark turned on the radio, finding a classic rock station, filling the space where conversation should be. "The cabin's in good shape," he offered as they left Pine Ridge behind. "I've been fixing it up on weekends. Helps me think, working with my hands." Sarah watched the familiar landmarks pass by, each one laden with memories of happier times, when they were a family, when Emma was alive and safe, and their biggest worry was which bedtime story to read. The drive to the cabin took them away from pine-ridged suburban streets and into the dense Oregon wilderness. Mark navigated the winding forest roads with practiced ease, the truck's headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Tall Douglas firs pressed in on both sides, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out the fading daylight. "Remember the first time we brought Emma up here?" Mark said, his voice softer than it had been all day. "She was only 3, kept asking if bears lived in the trees." Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling slightly. "She made you check under the cabin for bear caves, with a flashlight and everything." Mark chuckled, and then she decided she wanted to be friends with any bears we found. The familiar rhythm of shared memories eased some of the day's sharp edges. Mark continued, talking, his hands relaxing on the steering wheel as he recalled Emma's adventures at the lake, that first sunfish she caught. "God, you'd have thought she'd landed a whale." Insisted we take 50 pictures of her holding it. She wanted to keep it as a pet. Sarah added, surprising herself by engaging in the conversation after the morning's horror. Talking about happy memories felt both painful and necessary, so I had to explain, catch and release, while she gave the fish a name and a full backstory. Mark said, "Princess Bubbles, wasn't it?" Princess Bubbles 3. Apparently there had been 2 previous fish royalty we didn't know about. They drove in companionable silence for a few minutes, winding higher into the hills. Sarah gazed out at the familiar landmarks. The old ranger station, now abandoned, the turnoff for the hiking trail where Emma had collected pine cones, the wooden bridge over Cedar Creek where they'd played Pustix. "I'm glad you kept the cabin," Sarah heard herself saying. "I know I was angry during the divorce, but these memories matter." Mark glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "It's the only place that still feels Like she's alive, you know, like she might come running through the door any minute. With a jar full of salamanders, as they turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, Sarah's chest tightened with anticipation and dread. The headlights swept across the familiar structure, a modest A-frame with a wraparound deck nestled among towering pines. To her surprise, the cabin looked well maintained.